Yo, I am Dorki, and welcome to my Protection Paladin guide for Dragonflight. I will mostly be covering M+ specifically. If you are completely new to the game or the class, you might want to start off by checking out a Wowhead guide to learn the basics. Let's start off with talking about talent build. This is my recommended build. On the main tree, we have utility options like Blessing of Freedom and Cleanse Toxins. You could remove these if you don't need them, and you could pick up Cavalier plus Seasoned Warhorse if you need the mobility. Down here, we can also take out Judgment of Light for Turn Evil in some situations, and even improved Blessing of Protection. On the Protection tree, you want to play this build for the most part. It's a good mix of damage and survivability. In this tree, we can take out Inspiring Vanguard for Uther's Counsel for a shorter bubble and Blessing of Protection, or we could go for Blessing of Spell Warding if we need it, and we could go for Consecrated Grounds if we need it slow. As usual, prioritize item level, but when given a choice of stat, focus on haste followed by mastery or verse. Mastery is a bit more favorable, but will require you to be more conscious of being in consecrate. Let's talk about the important things to track. Paladins have quite a bit more to worry about than before. The obvious ones are Shield of Righteous, Consecration, and Holy Power. Consecration is much more important to track than before because Paladins don't really have empty globals anymore. Blessing of Dusk and Dawn will also be important to track to keep up. With the wide array of defensive, Paladins now have track your defensives as well. Rotationally, Paladins will play very much the same-ish as before. The only important thing is you will now prioritize Hammer of Wrath and Judgment over Avenger Shield, even in AoE. Judgment in particular is extremely important because of Sanctified Wrath and Zealot's Paragon. The goal is to extend your wings and spend as much holy power as possible. Consecration should also be used as late as possible to avoid wasting globals on non-holy power generators or Avenger Shields. For defensive usages, this is where Paladin changes a lot. The general gameplay should be starting pulls with Sentinel, Eye of Tyr towards the end of it, Ardent Defender afterwards, then Guardians of Ancient Kings if necessary, and Divine Shield as the last resort. If you ever dip low with any of these up, Gift of Golden Valkyr will save you from any potential deaths. With this many defensives, Paladins are mostly unkillable. One important thing is to try avoid using Word of Glory unless you really have to. Even with the free proc, you are usually better off using that global on one of your main rotational abilities over Word of Glory until you dip low. So to start a pull, always pull before going to combat by spamming Blessed Hammer. This could be used out of combat, meaning you should always enter a pull with at least 3 holy power. Tag mobs with Judgment and Avenger Shield as a group. Shield of Righteous can also be used while picking up mobs. Prioritize using Avenger Shield on caster mobs for the silencing effect. Once you plant, use Consecrate and start spending your holy power to activate Dawn and Dusk. You can use Sentinel early into the pull and hit Divine Toe when the mobs are fully grouped for max AoE burst. From here, focus on keeping Judgment, Hammer of Wrath, and Avenger Shield on cooldown. Don't overcap on holy power and maintain your Dusk and Dawn buff. Now that we've covered the basics, we can talk a bit more about how you should be planning in dungeons. Before going into a pull, I always try to have at least 4 holy power to activate Blessing of Dawn right away. Try to always enter pulls with Sentinel. If you don't have Sentinel, getting aggro can be finicky. Most of your power right now revolves around Sentinel. You might even have to bubble taunt at the beginning of pulls if you're doing back-to-back large pulls. I'd always recommend trying to pull smaller outside of Sentinel and chain when it comes back up. Don't ever sit on your defensive cooldowns and always try to have something up. In general, it should look something like this. You will have a Sentinel for the first 30 seconds, then Eye of Tyr for another 10 seconds after, Ardent Defender, and that should buy you enough time to have Sentinel shortly after. Use Guardian of Ancient Kings to fill in any gaps. As a Paladin, you have the most utility of any tank. Figure out ahead of time where you can make use of all your utility. Use a Focus Avenger Shield macro. With this, you can effectively lock down 2 caster mobs at once. You can target one mob with Divine Resonance shield procs, and use Avenger Shield or Focus Avenger Shield, Interrupt and Focus Interrupt, and even Hammer of Justice or Focus Hammer of Justice for another 6-second stun. This is where the power of Paladin lies, especially in Dragonflight with all these kicks and stuns required. There are also a lot of dungeons where Paladin can save people with Lay on Hands, Blessing of Protection, or Blessing of Sacrifice, and even Blessing of Spell Warding. Blessing of Protection can remove nasty bleeds like the ones in Nokud, or the bleeds on Fenrir from Halls of Valor. Even Blessing of Freedom can be insanely valuable in some dungeons. You will want to spec into some utility like Turn Evil in Shadow Moon Burial Ground for the first boss ad. Blessing of Spell Warding can be insanely powerful for both yourself and as an external defensive in these high magic damage dungeons like Temple of Jade Serpent and Ruby Life Pools. And that is it for the guide. Paladin isn't too hard to pick up, but will require making full use of everything to be played at its maximum potential. Paladin is one of my favorite tanks for carrying dungeons, and when played well, it is extremely rewarding. Thanks for watching, have fun in Dragonflight.